So the aims for today are to outline the features and characteristics of the different types of human service organisations, to describe the various types of human service organisations looking at structure, models and processes, to explore the ways in which the context influences practice, to critically analyse the different dilemmas and tensions of working in human service organisations, and to highlight the importance of developing skills to work in an interprofessional context and collaboratively across organisations. And I think for me, really, some of the key words are networking, interprofessional context, collaboration. Those are real key skills to develop in terms of working in organisations. So what are some of the different types of organisations? I think, well, I mentioned already since coming to Australia, I've worked in community organisations. I've worked in government, sort of local and state. There's also federal. There are church-led and spiritual-based organisations, non-government organisations, charities, international organisations, and social enterprises. So, what are the differences between all of those different types of organisations? Well, I guess, first of all, we'll maybe look more generally at organisations. So what are the features and characteristics of organisations in general? Well, they're about groups of people, whether that's groups of staff or groups of clients. They tend to have common goals. There's usually a formal and informal rule structure, policies and procedures, codes of conduct, ethics. There are structures and allocation of power, and with that comes allocation of resources and funding. They have boundaries. Those can be in terms of the client group. They can be geographical. They can be in terms of the age range of people that you work with. And organisations have varying degrees of stability and longevity. So if we look at organisational culture to start with, here on the left is a financial organisation, and we would probably assume that they tend to look at efficiency, profit. They're more business-like and they might have global reach. Whereas a community centre, on the other hand, is very much a people-centric and looks at being welcoming and friendly and tends to have more of a local focus. So what is organisational culture? Well, Robbins says it's a system of shared meaning held by members that distinguishes the organisation from other organisations. So that's fairly straightforward. Looking a little bit further, an organisation's culture is a reflection of a number of aspects, such as how it treats its people, its values, innovation, how risks are taken, how outcomes are pursued, what place teamwork and individual work has, and how traditions are valued and what values are valued, if that makes sense. Okay, and organisational culture is strongly related to values. So, as we've seen, it's particularly important for human service professionals. So, drilling down to human service organisations, they have the same features as other organisations, plus other features that make them different. So what might they be? Let's see what Hassenfeld says in 2010. Characteristics of human service organisations. The raw material is people. They can be ambiguous or have vague goals. They operate in turbulent environments with competing vested interests. Their technologies might be unclear in interventions not linked to outcomes. The relationship between staff and clients is a core determinant of success or failure. And there might be unreliable measures of effectiveness and resistance to innovation. I would say, for me, that's a little bit harsh. I think human service organisations that I've seen are inherently flexible and creative, and quite often value innovation as a way of doing things differently. Due to some of those challenges for funding, human service organisations tend to be extremely good at problem solving. And yes, the raw material is people, which means that the organisations are people focused. And I think particularly with organisations employing social workers and human service workers, there is a strong aspect of critical reflective practice, and hence interventions are based on perhaps theory, evidence-based practice, And I think they are linked to the outcomes, perhaps due to the managerial context that a lot of organisations are working in, but also I think due to the need to be able to look for best practice and what that looks like in each organisation. So key beliefs of human service organisations, Manning 2003. Working with people is moral work. Human services is gendered work. People are complicated. Goals are problematic. Turbulent environments affect external support. Technologies are indeterminate. Core activities are through relationships. And transforming people is difficult to measure. Yes, that's true. And I guess what's really interesting is this view of what human service organisations are. I also think it's exceedingly exciting work. Interesting to see that it's gendered work. We do see predominantly through the social work degrees there are more females than males coming into social work and human services, and it would be good to explore why that is. Now, we've all got different views, and we'll maybe bring that up on the discussion board, I think, because it is something to consider, because that does unfortunately influence pay. And there is still a discrepancy in the levels of pay between males and females in Australia. So one to maybe hold on to and address and have a think about. People are complicated, yes they are. Goals are problematic, yes, because how do you define what that goal is? And how can you elicit support for your work, particularly when sometimes the people that society sees social workers working with, they might not have I think the media, what I'm trying to say is perhaps perpetuates that sort of myth of deserving and undeserving. So sometimes external support can be problematic. Transforming people is difficult to measure. Yes, it is. So it is really important that we have evidence-based practice and we really look at theories and how we are measuring and what we're measuring and why we're measuring it. Anyway, let's have another look at human service organisations. What are they? They're usually public auspiced, government funding or legislative based. That means there's a financial, legal, administrative and quality accountability to government, whether it's local, state or federal. But they're not all government agencies. So let's have a look at some different types of human service organisations. So we've got government or public agency, a third sector, which is non-profit and community agencies, and then more and more these days we have private for-profit agencies. Particularly if you look at some of the services that are being sort of outsourced, that used to perhaps be state government services, particularly I'm thinking out-of-home care, and the sector is changing, so it is worthwhile just keeping an eye on what's going on, because that will be the sector that you'll be moving into. So, a little bit of a closer look at government agencies. So government departments or unit of department can be, e.g. Department of Child Welfare. So we're thinking sometimes the local government can be more things along the lines of community development. Then we've got state, obviously things like child safety, child welfare, housing, homelessness, and then looking at federal, so we've got FACSIA and different departments. And something to keep an eye on as well is, I think I went through 3 different department changes in my short time in government, name changes, and so it's just important to keep an eye on that as well. Okay, so government departments are authorised, established and operated through law or statute. Largely funded from Treasury directly to the department, and the staff are called public servants. Non-profit organisations. So usually an incorporated body with its own mission, goals and constitution, can have its own governing body in terms of a board or committee of management, quite often voluntary, and it might be an organisation or part of a religious body. So non-profit organisations continued. They might be funded wholly, or in part by public money and accountable to government. And a number of examples are community organisations, church-based organisations, charities, global NGOs, etc., etc. And as we're saying, some of the sort of the emerging organisations are private for-profit organisations. Don't get me wrong, they have been around for a long time, but we're seeing more of them emerging at the moment. So they might be a corporation, partnership and association. There can be a fee for services and or government funded to provide services, so it could usually a bit of a sort of half and half. Growing, when I say half and half, sorry, I mean part. Please don't take me literally when I'm saying these things, sorry, apologies. Okay, growing presence in the human service sector, and examples might be global corporations or private prisons, detention centres, private clinics, counselling services and private practitioners. And as we're aware as well, there are many more private social workers now with the Medicare rebate. So 2 other examples are faith-based organisations. So these are usually associated with a church or spiritual body, religious body. This is a term that's increasingly being used, and the religious values are espoused, though they might not be readily obvious. And quite often you might see in an advertisement that there's a requirement for staff to adhere to the values of the organisation. And if you look at the top 6 human service providers in Australia, are faith-based organisations. And then another example of a type of organisation is a collective. So that could be a cooperative with a non-hierarchical structure, shared decision making, and that can be with regards to the power, the tasks, responsibilities, risk, work on a consensual model, and requires a high level of trust. And quite often with a sort of political basis, e.g. feminism or socialism. And in terms of collectives, some social enterprise organisations can fit under the collective banner, and they can also look a little bit different as well. Right, so brief look at some organisational theories. So there's many different theoretical frameworks for understanding organisations. And as we've touched on before, theories explain the purpose, behaviour, change, power, leadership and management. And as practitioners in human services, we need to know and be able to use organisational theory. So, theory of bureaucracy. So Max Weber in the 19th century said that bureaucracy is based on power, domination and authority. It's hierarchical, it's large, it's impersonal and it's rigid. So what does authority look like? So traditional, over time, can be charismatic via having inspiring leaders. It can be legal rational, using rules and procedures to set the boundaries and the expectations. Then we're going to look at Taylorism, so scientific management. So this emerged in the early 20th century to increase productivity of workers, efficiency through scientific observation and experiment, managerialism, so looking at aspects such as performance enhancement, budgeting, quality and standards, audits, evaluation, efficiency and effectiveness. Quite often used in public sector non-government organisations. So I think part of me has a bit of a cold sweat when I look at that, and part of me goes, yep, no, actually, that's very helpful. Looking at human relations. So that emerged from some dissatisfaction with Taylorism, with looking at key to productivity being increasing employee satisfaction. And human relations dominate organisational practices and really brought the needs of workers into focus. So some of the strategies used to do that are consultation and participation of workers in decision making. But the critique is it is still ultimately about management, control and power. So it's maybe just that looking at Taylorism with the human element for the workers. Systems theory, I like this one. Used across a number of different domains, but it's a useful theory in analysing organisations, and the characteristics here are that this addresses the importance of relationships and interconnectedness, how people and organisations are interconnected. It's quite holistic, and it can be very useful for analysing organisational change, organisational boundaries, and identifying formal and informal systems within the organisation. So if we think a little bit about Eife's discourse of human services, and did you look up Eife when we were having our chat about ethics? So IFE looks at frameworks for understanding human service organisations, and it can be quite useful in identifying conflicts and tensions due to competing discourses. And that can help us be more confident in negotiating the organisational maze of practice, particularly as when we look back at some of the things we earlier on in the slides, the challenges of working with people, the challenges with identifying goals and outcomes and effectiveness. So this is quite a handy little diagram here. So IFE's competing discourse of human services. So anarchic, bottom up, hierarchic, top down. So positivist, humanist. So just have a look at the different aspects. So we're saying managerial, up here in the top left corner. Welfare is a product for the consumer. The worker is a case manager accountable to management. And then going over to the top right, so still being sort of hierarchical, looking at the sort of top-down approach, professional. So welfare is a service for the client. The worker is professional and accountable to the client and the profession. So then looking at that sort of bottom-up sort of positivist approach, sort of looking at the market sort of aspect of human services. So welfare is a commodity for the consumer or the customer. The worker is a broker or entrepreneur and is accountable through customer choice. And then to that sort of bottom right corner, community. Welfare as participation for the citizen, worker as a community enabler, and accountable through democratic decision making. So have a think about which quadrant you feel most comfortable in. Now you might feel comfortable right bang in the middle, or you might lean towards perhaps the left, the right, the top, the bottom. And that might help you start to analyse the type of organisation that you'd like to work in as well. Of course, organisations wouldn't be organisations without tensions and dilemmas. So what might some of those be about? Quest for funding. Always a huge tension when working in human services. And recently, I remember one of the managers of a community centre talking to me about that stress and that fatigue that workers were experiencing with that roller coaster ride of waiting for funding, being turned down for funding, and then managing to stay open, and then thinking they're going to close, and then no, there's some more funding coming. So that can be emotionally stressful as well as practically affecting time, reporting commitments, competitive tendering, and it can be quite reactive instead of being proactive. So the professional roles as well, the impact of managerialism and the erosion of professionalism. So how do those impact on each other, and how would that affect your role in an organisation? Context and place. The location. Have you got a geographical location? Are you more online, offering online counselling? How does context and place impact your ability to offer a service? Management and leadership. Content-free management. Well, I think if we link that back to organisational culture that we talked around earlier, those are some really important conversations to be had. And then collaboration and working in teams. The challenge is working with others who may have different views and values. So teams that are made up of a number of different disciplines, or teams that are very, very small, or teams that are very, very big, or teams that are then negotiating with other teams within the same organisation. And then we go on to the management of risk. So do you think we lose some of our integrity in what we do by becoming risk averse? Or is risk a very, very sensible way of working? Managing risk is a very sensible way of working in human service organisations. It's interesting just to have a think about, I guess, where you sit in terms of risk and accountability, because that as well helps you to identify the sort of organisation you'll be quite comfortable in. So human service organisations are now required to assess risks associated with activities and minimise adverse outcomes. So again, very sensible, but when you're working with people, how do you mitigate risk? And is risk taking not a normal part of progress and development? Those are some of the tensions that you'll be working within. A tension between accountability and responsiveness. And unfortunately, the fear of reprimand, dismissal or litigation. And that can mean that options are more restrictive with clients. And then looking at that concept of risk identities.